The courthouse ledgers were never intended to be viewed by the public. Stored in a neglected cellar of the aging Richmond County Administrative Building, these leather-bound tomes had survived blazes, deluges, and decades of intentional disregard. When the Preservation Society started converting historical files into digital formats in 2009, an intern named Rebecca Chen spotted something odd in a plantation transfer record from 1847. The identical woman's name surfaced 5 times across 5 separate estates within a span of only 7 years. Every notation was paired with a remark that forced the historian to halt and contact her director. With newborn infant, the revelation would expose one of the most agonizing patterns ever recorded in antebellum property files. 5 estates, 5 births, 5 transactions, all within 7 years, all involving the same individual. The mathematical regularity was terrifying, the consequences even more grim. But to comprehend what those records truly showed, what they listed in detached figures and technical prose, we must return to the beginning. To a woman whose life was recorded not in journals or correspondence, but in purchase slips, birth certificates, and the heartless math of human trade. Before we proceed with the account of Martha and the 5 estates that served as her cage, ensure you are subscribed to our channel and press that notification icon so you never overlook narratives like this one. And inform us in the remarks, what region are you viewing from? Let us explore together what these archives exposed. What the preservation group discovered wasn't merely one person's misfortune, it was proof of a framework, a design, a mechanism of exploitation so systematic it left a paper trail that no one imagined would ever be scrutinized. Martha reached Riverside Plantation on a muggy Tuesday morning in April 1840. She was 19 years old, bought at a sale in Charleston for $800, a significant amount that indicated not only her youth and vitality, but something more prized and perilous: verified literacy. The bill of sale kept in the Charleston Municipal Archives catalogued her abilities: reading, writing, math, sewing, and culinary skills. In a period when instructing enslaved individuals to read was prohibited in many Southern territories, Martha's education made her both prized and suspect. The auction had occurred in a brick depot near the docks, where the scent of brine mingled with perspiration and dread. Martha had occupied a wooden stage while gentlemen in expensive coats checked her teeth, her limbs, her bearing. They requested that she read sections from the Charleston Courier. She obeyed, her tone firm, her vision fixed on the text rather than the countenances observing her. When the offers hit $800, William Hargrove signaled one last time and Martha became his asset. Riverside spanned 1,200 acres of rich soil along the Savannah River just north of the Georgia line. The primary residence was a 3-story Georgian building with white pillars that were visible from the water, a display of riches and authority seen by anyone traveling past. Behind the house, tidy rows of cotton crops reached toward the woods that defined the estate boundary. Near the main residence stood the outbuildings, a kitchen, a laundry, sheds, barns, and a string of small huts where the laborers resided. William Hargrove had taken over Riverside from his father in 1837, along with 63 enslaved people and significant liabilities. At 32, he was set on reviving the plantation's success through what he termed modern administrative tactics. He maintained precise ledgers tracking every bundle of cotton, every unit of seed, every cent spent and gained. He also kept specific logs of his human assets. Names, years, abilities, buys, trades, births, and passings, all tracked in tidy rows of dark ink. Riverside's log recorded Martha's arrival with characteristic brevity, April 14, 1840. Martha, female, age 19, bought at Charleston sale, price $800. Skills, literate, domestic work. Placed in main house under supervision of Mrs. Hargrove. The domestic staff included 9 individuals, a chef, 2 kitchen assistants, 3 housemaids, 2 laundry staff, and a stable hand who also cared for the flora. Martha was tasked to work under the immediate oversight of Eleanor Hargrove, William's spouse, a slender woman of 30 with constantly tight lips and a fame for religious harshness. Mrs. Hargrove managed the home with rigid discipline, demanding total quiet during dining, instant compliance with all orders, and outward thanks for the kindness of being sheltered, nourished, and outfitted. Martha's schedule started before daybreak. She woke in the early gloom, dressed in the coarse cotton garment and bib that served as her outfit, and hurried to the main residence to start fires in the chambers and sitting room. By the time the Hargrove family stirred, the home had to be cozy, water had to be boiled, and the morning meal had to be in progress. Her early hours were dedicated to tidying rooms, preparing beds with sharp folds that Mrs. Hargrove would check with a straight edge, cleaning objects, and scrubbing metalware. Midday meant washing boiling water, scrubbing fabrics on boards, hanging items to dry, and smoothing with heavy irons warmed on the range. Nights involved serving food, tidying the dining area and kitchen, and setting the home for sleep. She seldom finished before 9 or 10 p.m, and then she had to trek back to her hut in the quarters, spent to rest on her mat until the routine restarted before light. The labor was unending, yet Martha persisted. She had mastered endurance early. Never catch their gaze directly, but never look rebellious. Act swiftly, but not frantically. Talk only when prompted. Predict requirements before they are stated. Turn ghost-like except when called upon. She formed no bonds among the other house staff at first, knowing that intimacy invited danger. She watched, studied the patterns of the residents, and tried to make herself as useful and invisible as possible. The other domestic workers slowly started to permit her presence. There was Dinah, the chief cook, a woman in her 50s whose talent with complex dishes had made Riverside well known among the local elite. There was Esther, 23, who worked in the kitchen and had 2 toddlers in the quarters. There was Clara, 16, jumpy and fast, who had been shifted to laundry after being too awkward to serve at the table. These women spoke to Martha in snatches, a hint about Mrs. Hargrove's temper, guidance on which chores to focus on, small tokens of unity that couldn't be fully voiced, but were grasped regardless. 3 months after Martha's arrival in July, a new manager arrived at Riverside. His name was Dutch Carmichael, a man of 35 with auburn hair and a skin hardened by years of field work. Hargrove had recruited him from an estate in South Carolina, drawn by Carmichael's fame for boosting output and upholding order. Carmichael shifted into the manager's house, a tiny shack near the barns, and started enforcing new rules. Earlier shifts, reduced eating times, tighter counts of cotton collected, and swift discipline for any seen sluggishness. Within days, Carmichael started showing strange interest in Martha. It began subtly. He would show up near the kitchen when Martha was hauling water. He would observe her hanging washing, standing just in her side vision. He started inventing reasons to call her for chores, delivering notes to field hands, checking stocks in barns, tasks that pulled her away from the primary house and the observant eyes of the other staff. The other women noticed at once. Dinah tried to keep Martha near the kitchen. Esther cautioned her with glances when Carmichael neared. Clara whispered tensely one night, "Do not go anywhere alone. Stay where people can see you." But there was no place truly protected, no power to plead with, no safety under any statute. An enslaved woman had no legal capacity to decline any order from any white person, and everyone understood this. In early August, Carmichael trapped Martha in the laundry shed. It was late day, the sunlight cutting through the glass, making sharp shadows. The other laundry staff had left to fix food. Martha was folding cloths when she heard the latch and realized she was no longer by herself. What occurred in the laundry shed that day was never noted in any log or paper. Martha never discussed it with anyone, but the cycle it started would follow her across 5 estates and 7 years. By October, Martha understood she was pregnant. She informed no one, wrapping her middle tightly with fabric to hide the shifts. She kept working, moving through her hours with the same silent speed, while fear and resentment struggled inside her. She knew what a child meant. She had witnessed it before, had heard the hushed accounts among enslaved women about infants born and traded away, about mothers split from their babies, about the specific danger of carrying a child whose father was a white man. By January 1841, hiding it was impossible. Her frame gave her away despite the raps. Mrs. Hargrove saw during a session for new staff uniforms, her thin digits suddenly clenching Martha's arm with unexpected power. "You are expecting," Mrs. Hargrove said, her tone flat. It wasn't a query. Martha remained silent. What could she utter? That night, Mrs. Hargrove told the news to her spouse in his office. William Hargrove listened, his expression blank, and then called for Dutch Carmichael. The talk in Hargrove's office lasted 17 minutes. The domestic staff working in the nearby spaces heard loud tones but couldn't distinguish words. Carmichael came out with a red face, jaw set, and walked straight to the manager's shack without a word to anyone. 3 days later, Carmichael was let go from Riverside. The log noted, Jan 19, 1841, let go Dutch Carmichael manager. Reason, breach of house rules. Paid final salary, 47 ton. The same day, Martha was shifted from the main residence to a hut at the very edge of the quarters, as distant from the house as possible while staying on the grounds. It was a tiny hut previously used for tools with a ground floor, one window, and a hearth that smoked heavily. She was provided a haybed, 2 rugs, and commands to stay there until after the delivery. For the next 4 months, Martha lived in almost total solitude. Esther brought her food twice a day, bread, milk, sometimes a bit of meat or plants. She was not allowed to go to the night prayers or the rare Sunday meetings. She was given no chores. She lived in a strange gap, neither fully part of the estate group nor entirely detached from it. The solitude gave Martha space to reflect, to mourn, to ready herself. She thought of her own mother, traded away when Martha was 7. She thought of the future inside her, a child she hadn't planned for but would cherish anyway. She thought of fleeing. The woods were near, and she knew accounts of people who had fled north. But she also knew the truth. Tracking dogs, patrols, the savage penalties for those caught trying to run. On May 3, 1841, Martha went into labor. The birth was aided by Aunt Sarah, an elderly enslaved woman who acted as healer for the estate. The labor went for 14 hours. In the dark hut, lit only by a candle and the hearth, Martha brought her girl into the world as spring rain hit the roof. The estate birth log, kept in the Riverside Ledger, listed May 3, 1841. Female infant born to Martha, domestic, child fit, weight roughly 7 lbs, mother recovered. Father unknown. Martha titled her girl Sarah after the healer who had stayed with her through the long night. The name was never put into any formal file. For 6 dear weeks, Martha stayed in the hut with her girl. She held Sarah, fed her, sang to her in hushed tones, memorized every part of her small face. These were the only 6 weeks in Sarah's life when she would have her mother's total care, when Martha could just be her mother without the heavy weight of bondage deciding every second. Then, on a muggy morning in late June, William Hargrove showed up at Martha's hut with a man she had never encountered. The man wore a fine coat, despite the warmth, and held a leather bag full of files. This was Vernon Hughes, a human merchant who worked between Charleston and Augusta, buying and selling people with the casual speed of someone trading cattle. They stood outside the hut for several minutes. Martha, inside with Sarah, could see them through the pane, Hargrove pointing, Hughes checking files, nodding, sometimes looking toward the hut door. The deal was being finished with Martha just feet away, as if she were not a person with thoughts and heart, but just goods being moved between owners. Finally, Hargrove hit the door. Martha opened it, clutching Sarah. "Martha," Hargrove said in a firm tone, "you and the infant have been traded. Mr. Hughes here will be moving you to a new place. You have 30 minutes to pack your items." The estate ledger noted June 28, 1841, sale of Martha, age 20, and baby girl to Hughes Trading Company, Charleston. Price, $750. Reason for trade, conduct, transfer. Funds put toward estate costs. Martha was allowed exactly 30 minutes. She swaddled Sarah in the cleanest rug she had, took her few items, a brush, a second garment, a small wooden cross Esther had secretly provided, and walked out of the hut. Esther and Dinah stood far off, not talking, not coming near, but witnessing. Their expressions said what their mouths could not. "I am sorry. God stay with you." Martha went into the rear of Vernon Hughes's cart. 3 other enslaved people were already present, 2 men and a woman, all looking shocked, all recently bought from nearby lands. The cart moved away from Riverside, its wheels grinding on the stone path. Martha looked back once at the estate that had been her home for 14 months. She saw the white pillars of the house shining in the morning light. She saw the zones where people were already working in the cotton. She saw the quarters where she had lived those first months, and the lonely hut where she had given birth. She would never see Riverside again. But in a dark way, she would never depart from it either. What had occurred there, the gaze, the force, the pregnancy, the birth, the sale, would become the design that would mark the next 7 years of her existence. As the cart bumped north, Sarah slept in Martha's arms, unaware that her arrival had just cost her mother everything, unaware that they were both about to become pieces in a savage game that would be played out across 5 estates in 4 regions. This was just the start of Martha's path. The first estate had set the design. 4 more waited for her, each one repeating the same awful text. The county logs would list every deal with perfect care, but they would never record the personal toll. The cart trip from Riverside to Fairmont Estate lasted 3 days and covered nearly 90 miles through the woods and clay hills of Georgia. Vernon Hughes was a precise man who worked on tight plans and small gains. He paused only when required, short breaks to drink the horses, quick buys of bread and meat for his cargo, night stays at path taverns where the enslaved people were shut in sheds while Hughes slept in a mattress. Martha learned during this trip that she and the others were not being moved to a specific client. They were inventory. Hughes would pause at estates along his path, showing his goods to possible buyers, bargaining prices and making deals as chances surfaced. It was a grim math. Hughes had bought Martha and Sarah for $750 from Hargrove, and he needed to trade them for more than that to make a gain. Every day of food and stay used up his profit. On the 3rd day, Hughes's cart turned up a long path toward a large house. This was Fairmont Estate, a tobacco farm in central Georgia, owned by brothers Charles and Edmund Beaumont. The land had been in the Beaumont family for 2 cycles. Though recent thin crops and dropping tobacco prices had pushed them to work with fewer people and tighter funds than their father had known. Hughes had a set meeting with Charles Beaumont, who had sent word through a local dealer that he was looking to buy an educated female staffer. When the cart arrived, Charles Beaumont came out of the house, a heavy man of 50 with thin hair and a look of constant stress. His younger brother, Edmund, showed up from the tobacco shed, cleaning his palms on his pants. The bargaining happened in the front lawn of the house with Martha standing near, holding 8-week-old Sarah. Hughes showed Martha's files, proof of buy from Riverside, note of her education and house abilities, promises of her health and spirit. Charles Beaumont asked Martha to read out loud from a tobacco buyer's flyer. She did, her voice firm despite her fatigue from 3 days of travel. The price talk lasted 20 minutes. Hughes wanted $850, a $100 profit. Charles argued that a woman with a baby was less prized than a single woman, that the infant would be a cost for years before being big enough to labor, that times were hard and he couldn't afford a luxury. They settled on $650. The Fairmont log recorded Martha's arrival, July 2nd, 1841, bought 1 female, Martha, age 20, with baby girl roughly 8 weeks old. Former owner, Riverside Plantation via Hughes Trading Co. Price, $650. Skills noted, reading, writing, domestic work. Task, field labor, tobacco farming, field labor. The 2 words hit Martha like a punch. At Riverside, despite it all, she had been house staff. Tough labor, surely, but protected from the worst of the weather, with slightly better food and clothes than field hands. Field labor meant the crews, the sun, the manager's lash, the savage speed of planting and picking, and with a baby girl to mind. Charles Beaumont saw Martha's look and read it wrong. "You will do as told," he said sharply. "Your reading does not free you from real work. You will join the tobacco crews starting tomorrow dawn." Fairmont was different from Riverside in nearly every way. The estate was smaller, 600 acres farmed, but worked by nearly 80 enslaved people. The quarters were more packed with groups stuffed into tiny huts, sometimes 2 families in one room. The labor was tougher, the food thinner, the oversight more cruel. Martha was put in a hut with 2 other women. Patience, a field hand in her 40s who had lost 3 kids to sale, and Ruth, a young woman of 22 with twin boys who were 4 years old. The hut was maybe 12 FT by 14 FT with a dirt floor, 1 tiny pane, and a hearth that all 3 women used for food and heat. Solitude was impossible. Rest was hard. The twins wept at night. Sarah wept at different times, and all 3 women had to get up before light for their shifts. Tobacco farming needed different work than cotton. The crops needed constant care, moving plants, picking worms by hand, trimming the plants to help leaves grow, picking at the exact time of ripeness, hanging the leaves in sheds where the heat could hit 130 degrees. The work was precise, boring, and draining. Martha worked with Sarah tied to her chest in a wrap, a setup that made every turn more tough. When Sarah wept from hunger, Martha had to halt her work to feed her, getting angry looks from the manager. When rain fell, there was no cover. The work went on with everyone soaked. When the sun burned, there was little water and no shade. Martha learned to labor through fatigue, to push past hurt, to keep going because halting meant pain. Charles Beaumont was often gone from Fairmont, busy with tobacco deals in Augusta and Savannah, with social tasks in the nearby town of Milledgeville, with the constant money shifts needed to keep a failing estate going. Daily management went to his younger brother Edmund, who lived in a tiny house on the land and served as the actual manager. Edmund Beaumont was 42 years old and had never wed. He was a man of shifting spirits, sometimes fun and easy, allowing longer food breaks and lighter work tasks, sometimes explosive and mean, snapping in sudden rages over small slips. The workers learned to sense his mood by his walk and his drink. When he walked with easy trust, the day would be okay. When he walked with tight intent and smelled of liquor, everyone stayed wary. Within 2 weeks of Martha's arrival, Edmund started picking her out. At first, it was supposedly about her education. He would call her to the estate office, a small shack near the tobacco shed where files were kept and items stored, and have her read parts from farm magazines and tobacco reports out loud. He would sit at his table following along, asking her to say lines again, saying he needed help with the words. Martha saw quickly that Edmund could barely read himself. He could read easy text slowly, but anything hard left him lost. Her reading times became a fixed thing, 3 or 4 times a week, always in the late day or early night, always when the day's work was done and most people had gone back to the huts. The times started simply enough. But slowly, Edmund's care became more personal. He started asking Martha things about her past, about Riverside, about how she had learned to read. He started talking about her looks, saying that field labor was too tough for someone refined. He started touching her shoulder when he leaned to see a text, letting his hand stay. Patience saw when Martha came back from these times. Her face kept blank. "That man is trouble," she said softly one night as they made their thin dinner. "Edmund has been like this as long as I have been here. You watch yourself." But there was no way to watch herself that worked. Martha had no power to say no to Edmund's call, no way to avoid being alone with him, no help if he chose to use the total power he held over her. She could only bear it the way she had learned to bear everything else. By late October, Edmund's intent had become clear. The reading times had become excuses for something else entirely. Martha would emerge from the office later and later, her jaw clenched, her eyes distant. She said nothing to anyone because there was nothing to say. The other women understood without words. By early December 1841, Martha realized she was pregnant again. The realization came with a sense of crushing inevitability. She had been at Fairmont for only 5 months. Sarah was just 7 months old. And now another child was coming, conceived in violence, destined to complicate her life even further in a system that saw children as both economic assets and burdens, depending on who fathered them. This time, Martha didn't try to hide the pregnancy. What would be the point? By March 1842, when her condition became obvious to everyone, she simply continued working, her body straining under the dual burden of pregnancy and labor. She worked in the tobacco fields until she was 8 months pregnant, until the overseer who supervised the gangs, Edmund had hired a man named Foster to handle direct field supervision, finally moved her to lighter work hauling water, cooking for the field gangs, and cleaning the tobacco barn. In late May, Charles Beaumont returned from an extended trip to Savannah. Within 2 days, word reached him about Martha's pregnancy. The plantation was small enough that rumors traveled quickly, and this particular rumor, that Edmund had gotten the new literate servant pregnant, was too juicy to remain contained. Charles confronted his brother in the main house. The servants working nearby heard their voices rising, heard Charles's anger and Edmund's defensive protests. The argument lasted more than an hour and ended with Charles storming out and Edmund disappearing into his cottage, where he remained for 2 days. On June 12, 1842, Martha went into labor. This birth was attended by patients who had experience with childbirth and served as an informal midwife for the plantation's women. The labor was shorter than with Sarah, 9 hours, but more difficult. Martha was exhausted from months of fieldwork while pregnant, malnourished on the inadequate rations provided to enslaved workers, and psychologically shattered by the repetition of trauma. When the baby, a boy, finally emerged just after midnight, Martha held him and wept. She wept for him, for Sarah, for herself, for the impossibility of their situation. She named him Daniel, a name meaning, "God is my judge," though she barely believed in a God that would allow such suffering. The Fairmont birth record noted June 12, 1842. Male infant born to Martha, field worker. Child healthy, weight approx. 6 lbs. Mother survived difficult labor. Father unknown. The word unknown was a legal fiction everyone understood. Everyone knew who had fathered Daniel, but acknowledging it officially would create complications, questions of inheritance, of status, of scandal. Better to leave it officially unknown and handle the problem privately. The problem was handled 6 weeks later. On August 1, 1842, a slave trader named Foster arrived at Fairmont Estate. He was a younger man, perhaps 30, who operated out of Augusta and specialized in quick turnovers, buying enslaved people cheaply and reselling them rapidly for modest profits. He arrived in the afternoon, spent an hour in conversation with Charles Beaumont, and left with a bill of sale. The Fairmont Ledger recorded August 3, 1842. Sale of Martha, age 21, and 2 infant children to Foster & Sons Trading, Augusta. Sale price $700. Reason, reduction of unnecessary estate obligations. Proceeds applied to operational expenses. Martha was given 1 hour to prepare. She gathered Sarah, now 15 months old, gathered Daniel, 7 weeks old, wrapped them both in what cloth she had, and prepared to leave. Patience helped her pack, moving silently, her face wet with tears she didn't bother to hide. "You got strength," Patience whispered as they embraced goodbye. "More strength than anyone should need. You remember that? You got strength, and these babies got you." Martha climbed into Foster's wagon with her 2 children. As they pulled away from Fairmont Estate, she saw Edmund Beaumont watching from the window of his cottage. His face was expressionless. She had been at Fairmont for 13 months. She was leaving with 2 children and a sale price $75 lower than what she'd been purchased for just over a year earlier. The pattern was becoming clear, even if Martha didn't yet fully understand its implications. 2 plantations, 2 pregnancies, 2 sales, and 3 more plantations still to come. Foster's territory covered eastern Georgia and the western edge of South Carolina, a circuit he traveled regularly, buying enslaved people from struggling plantations and reselling them to more prosperous operations. His business model depended on volume and speed, quick purchases, quick sales, minimal investment in food and lodging for his stock. Martha and her children spent 2 weeks with Foster, first at his holding facility in Augusta, a warehouse near the river where enslaved people awaited sale, and then on a wagon journey northward. During those 2 weeks, Martha saw the machinery of the domestic slave trade up close. People arrived at the warehouse daily, processed like inventory, catalogued by age, sex, skills, and health. Families were routinely separated. Husbands sold to one buyer, wives to another, children divided among multiple purchases. The crying was constant, the desperation palpable, the cruelty casual. Martha kept Sarah and Daniel close every moment, terrified that Foster might decide it was more profitable to sell them separately. A literate woman might fetch a decent price, and children could be sold for future potential. But Foster seemed to recognize that Martha's value was increased by keeping the family together. A complete unit was easier to sell to certain types of buyers who preferred not to break up families, at least not visibly. On August 18, 1842, Foster's wagon climbed into the rolling hills of northern Georgia, approaching one of the largest and most prosperous plantations in the region. Oakwood Plantation sat on prime cotton-growing land, its 1,200 acres worked by nearly 200 enslaved people. The property belonged to the Prescott family, Robert Prescott, his wife Eleanor, and their 3 adult sons, Thomas, William, and James. The Prescott family represented old money and old power. Robert Prescott's grandfather had received a colonial land grant in the 1760s, and 3 generations had built Oakwood into a cotton empire. They were respected in the region, known for their public piety, their regular attendance at the Presbyterian Church, and their reputation as good slaveholders, which meant they rarely separated families, provided adequate food and clothing, and punished infractions with reasonable rather than extreme brutality. Foster had a standing relationship with Robert Prescott, who periodically purchased enslaved workers to replace those lost to disease, old age, or sale. When Foster's wagon arrived, Robert and his wife Eleanor emerged to inspect the available stock. Eleanor Prescott was a formidable woman of 55, tall and straight-backed, who took personal interest in managing the household and maintaining what she considered Christian standards of plantation operation. The negotiation over Martha happened largely between Foster and Robert Prescott, though Eleanor interjected frequently. Foster presented Martha's documentation, emphasizing her literacy and previous experience in household service, downplaying the fieldwork at Fairmont. Robert was interested in the literacy but concerned about the 2 young children. "She'll be consumed with caring for infants," Robert observed, "limited productivity for years." Foster adjusted his price downward, $625 for all 3. Eleanor Prescott examined Martha directly, asking her to read from a Bible passage, testing her penmanship on a slate, and asking about her experience with household management. Martha answered carefully, presenting herself as capable and compliant, knowing her life and her children's lives might depend on this performance. The sale was completed. The Oakwood records show August 18, 1842, purchase of 1 female Martha, aged 21, with 2 infant children, female approx 15 months, male approx 8 weeks. Previous owner, Foster and Sons Trading via Fairmont Estate. Purchase price $625. Skills, literate household service. Assignment, spinning house, general household support. Oakwood was unlike any place Martha had experienced. The scale was overwhelming. 200 people living in the quarters, a main house with 12 rooms, cotton fields that seemed to stretch to the horizon. The organization was military in its precision. Every person had a specific role. Every day followed a strict schedule. Every activity was logged and monitored. Martha was assigned to the spinning house, a long, low building where cotton was processed into thread by a dozen enslaved women working spinning wheels. The work was tedious, but not physically brutal, sitting at the wheel, maintaining a steady rhythm, producing consistent thread. The environment was relatively sheltered from weather, though hot in summer and cold in winter. Most importantly, Eleanor Prescott had decreed that mothers with young children could keep their children nearby while working as long as the children didn't disrupt productivity. Martha set up a corner of the spinning house with blankets for Sarah and Daniel. While she worked at her wheel, Sarah played quietly or slept, and Daniel spent most of his time either sleeping or nursing. The other women in the spinning house gradually accepted Martha's presence, sharing advice about managing children while working, offering occasional help when both babies cried simultaneously. For 3 months, life at Oakwood achieved a kind of stability Martha had never known. The work was demanding, but not impossible. She was reunited with household-type work rather than field labor. Her children were with her. The food rations were slightly more substantial than at Fairmont, a peck of cornmeal per week, a few pounds of salt pork, occasionally vegetables from the kitchen garden. Eleanor Prescott insisted on rest from labor every Sunday, allowing time for washing clothes, tending small personal gardens some of the enslaved people were allowed to maintain, and attending mandatory prayer services. The prayer services were held in a small building near the quarters, led by a white minister from the nearby town who came every Sunday afternoon to preach to the enslaved congregation. The sermons invariably focused on obedience, acceptance of one's station, and the promise of heavenly reward for earthly suffering. Martha sat through these services with her face carefully neutral, wondering what kind of God would create such a system and call it divine will. In late November, everything changed when James Prescott returned from university. James was the youngest of the 3 Prescott sons, 23 years old, recently completed 2 years of legal studies at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. He was tall and handsome with his mother's refined features and his father's commanding presence. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything, who had never imagined that his desires might not be immediately gratified. He had returned to Oakwood full of ideas about plantation management, about modernization and efficiency, about implementing new systems he had read about in agricultural journals. His father indulged him, allowing James to tour the various operations, fields, barns, processing buildings, and make observations and recommendations. James noticed Martha within his first week home. She was working at her spinning wheel when he entered the spinning house with his father, touring the facilities. James watched the women work, asked questions about productivity rates, and examined the quality of thread being produced. His gaze lingered on Martha, her obvious literacy evident in the way she held herself, her careful attention to the quality of her work, her quiet competence. "This one," James said to his father, pointing at Martha. "She's literate, you said." Robert confirmed it, and James's interest was clearly piqued. Over the following days, he found reasons to visit the spinning house frequently, always with questions, always watching Martha work. Within 2 weeks, James had persuaded his father to reassign Martha to assist with plantation records. The spinning house produced large quantities of thread that needed to be logged, measured, and tracked. Martha's literacy made her ideal for this task. She was given a desk in the small office attached to the spinning house and assigned to maintain daily production logs, recording the amount and quality of thread produced by each worker. The assignment seemed like a promotion, slightly less physically demanding work, an acknowledgement of her skills. But Martha felt immediate dread. The office was isolated, separate from the main spinning room where the other women worked, and James Prescott found many reasons to spend time in that office. At first, his interest seemed genuinely focused on the work. He would review Martha's logs, asking detailed questions about productivity, having her read passages from agricultural journals about textile manufacturing, and discussing ways to improve efficiency. Martha answered carefully, navigating the dangerous terrain between demonstrating competence and not appearing too intelligent or independent. But gradually, inevitably, James's attention became personal. He began arriving in the office late in the afternoon after the other women had finished their shifts. He would sit close to Martha as she explained the log entries, his arm brushing against hers. He began making comments about her appearance, her voice, her intelligence, comments that made Martha's skin crawl, even as she forced herself to accept them without visible reaction. By Christmas 1842, the pretense of professional interest had collapsed entirely. James's visits to the office became brazenly inappropriate. The door closed, his commands explicit. Martha had no recourse, no protection, no possibility of refusal. She was owned property. He was the owner's son. The arithmetic of power was absolute. She tried to avoid being alone, tried to time her work so she would leave before his afternoon visits, tried to bring her children with her as a deterrent. Nothing worked. James simply ordered her to return to the office, to leave the children with another woman, and to comply with his demands. By March 1843, Martha realized she was pregnant again, the third time in less than 3 years. This pregnancy was different from the start. Martha fell ill in her 4th month, developing a fever that lasted for weeks. She became too weak to work, confined to her cabin, her body struggling to sustain both herself and the pregnancy while fighting infection. Sarah, now 2 years old, tried to care for her younger brother Daniel, bringing Martha water and patting her face the way she had seen adults do when someone was sick. Eleanor Prescott, whether motivated by genuine concern or fear of losing valuable property, had Martha moved to a cabin near the main house where she could be more closely monitored. A doctor was summoned, Dr. Mitchell, from the nearby town, an extraordinary expense for an enslaved person, but deemed necessary to protect the Prescott family's investment. Dr. Mitchell diagnosed Martha with severe pneumonia, complicated by pregnancy. He prescribed quinine, bed rest, and nutritious food, luxuries rarely afforded to enslaved people. For 6 weeks, Martha hovered between life and death, her fever spiking and breaking, her body weakening, while Eleanor Prescott supervised her care with stern efficiency. Slowly, painfully, Martha recovered. By June, she was strong enough to sit up, to eat without assistance, and to hold her children again. The pregnancy had survived, though Martha had lost considerable weight and remained weak. In September 1843, after a difficult 36-hour labor, Martha gave birth to another daughter. The birth was attended by Dr. Mitchell, another unprecedented expense because the previous illness had left everyone concerned about complications. The baby was born small but healthy, weighing perhaps 5.5 lbs. The Oakwood birth record noted September 12, 1843. Female infant born to Martha, spinning houseworker. Difficult delivery following mother's severe illness earlier in pregnancy. Child exhibits initial weakness but responds well to treatment. Mother and infant both survived labor. Heavy blood loss. Mother required extended recovery. Father unknown. Martha named her daughter Rebecca. She chose the name because it meant to bind or to tie, and Martha felt bound to her children, to this impossible situation, to survival itself. The aftermath unfolded with what was becoming a familiar pattern. Someone, Martha never knew who, but suspected one of the house servants who had noticed James's frequent visits to the spinning house office, informed Robert Prescott about his son's involvement. The confrontation happened late one evening. The entire quarters could hear the shouting from the main house, Robert's voice thundering, James's voice defensive, and Eleanor's voice cutting through both with icy precision. The argument lasted more than an hour and ended with James leaving Oakwood the next morning, sent to manage a smaller Prescott property in South Carolina, effectively exiled from the family's primary estate. For 10 weeks after Rebecca's birth, Martha remained at Oakwood, recovering from the difficult delivery and caring for her 3 children. Sarah was 2.5 years old, beginning to talk in full sentences. Daniel was 16 months, just learning to walk. Rebecca was a newborn who demanded constant attention. Martha allowed herself to hope, just briefly, that perhaps she might be allowed to stay at Oakwood. that perhaps the Prescotts would consider her service valuable enough to overlook her complicated history. Perhaps the pattern would finally break. Then on a cold morning in late November, a well-dressed slave trader named Ashworth arrived at Oakwood. He spent 2 hours in conversation with Robert Prescott, examining documents and negotiating terms. The Oakwood Ledger recorded November 29, 1843, sale of Martha, age 22, and 3 children, ages 2 years 6 months, 1 year 4 months, and 10 weeks to Ashworth Acquisitions, Charleston. Sale price $650. Reason: reassignment of assets due to changing household needs. Proceeds applied to estate expansion fund. The price had gone up slightly, perhaps reflecting Martha's proven resilience, or perhaps because 3 children represented potential future labor. But Martha noticed what others might not. She was still worth less than the $800 she had originally been sold for, despite being in the prime of her working life. Martha gathered her 3 children, her meager belongings, and prepared to leave for the 4th time. As Ashworth's wagon rolled down the oak-lined drive leading away from Oakwood, Martha looked back at the plantation that had promised stability but delivered only another iteration of the same pattern. 3 plantations, 3 pregnancies, 3 sales, and she was still only 22 years old. What Martha didn't yet fully understand was that each sale was making her less valuable. Each child was marking her as problematic. Each pregnancy was creating a documentary trail that would follow her through the ledgers and records of the domestic slave trade. She was being systematically devalued, turned from a premium servant into damaged goods, all because of crimes committed against her that she had no power to prevent. 2 more plantations awaited her. The pattern was not finished. Ashworth's territory covered a vast region from Charleston through Georgia and into Alabama, following the profitable trade routes where cotton was king and enslaved labor was the foundation of wealth. He was a more sophisticated operator than Foster, better dressed, more connections, higher-end clientele. He specialized in quality stock, enslaved people with skills, training, or other attributes that commanded premium prices from wealthy planters. Martha's situation was complicated. On one hand, her literacy and household skills made her theoretically valuable. On the other hand, 3 children under 3 years old made her immediately less appealing to most buyers, and her history, visible in the trail of sales and transfers that appeared on her documentation, raised questions that Ashworth had to carefully manage. The solution was to market Martha as a family unit to a very specific type of buyer: wealthy planters who could afford to take on the short-term burden of young children in exchange for long-term labor value, and who prided themselves on their benevolence in not breaking up families. Ashworth transported Martha and her children to his main facility in Charleston, where they spent 3 weeks while he searched for the right buyer. The facility was a large brick building near the slave market, divided into cells where enslaved people awaited sale. Martha and her children were kept in a room with 8 other women and their children, all waiting, all trying not to think about what came next. Finally, in mid-December 1843, Ashworth secured a buyer. Jonathan Whitfield, owner of Cedar Hills Plantation in eastern Alabama, one of the wealthiest men in the territory. Cedar Hills was the largest property Martha had yet encountered. 1,800 acres of prime cotton land, nearly 300 enslaved workers, and a main house that looked like something from a storybook. Jonathan Whitfield had inherited the plantation from his father and expanded it through shrewd investments in land and cotton futures. At 54 years old, he was a widower. His wife had died in childbirth 8 years earlier, and managed his vast operation with meticulous attention to detail and an ironclad sense of order. Whitfield had specific requirements. He wanted a literate woman to assist with household correspondence and records. He was willing to accept children as part of the arrangement, provided they would eventually contribute to the plantation's labor force. Ashworth assured him that Martha fit these requirements perfectly. The sale was completed through correspondence, with Ashworth transporting Martha and her children westward to Alabama. The journey took a week, the longest distance Martha had yet traveled, carrying her further and further from the Carolinas and Georgia she had known. The Cedar Hills records show December 20th, 1843, purchase of one female Martha, age 22, with 3 young children, ages 2 years, 6 months, 1 year, 5 months, and 11 weeks. Previous owner, Ashworth Acquisitions via Oakwood Plantation, Georgia. Purchase price $600. Skills, literacy, correspondence, household service. Assignment, main house staff. Children to be housed in nursery quarters. Special notation, premium paid for literacy skills. Purchase approved by J. Whitfield personally. For the first time in her life, Martha was separated from her children. Cedar Hills was so large that different functions were strictly segregated. The main house staff lived in small cabins near the primary residence, while a centralized nursery was maintained in the main quarters where infants and young children were cared for by elderly enslaved women who were no longer capable of field labor. This allowed mothers to work full days without the distraction of childcare. Martha protested, begged to keep her children with her, but Whitfield's system was absolute. Rooms in an outbuilding behind the house served as the quarters for the domestic staff. The field hands resided in the quarters a quarter-mile away, and children too young for labor stayed in the nursery quarters, a massive structure overseen by 3 elderly enslaved women who looked after dozens of toddlers while their parents worked elsewhere on the estate. Martha was assigned to a tiny chamber in the servants' building, just large enough for a narrow cot and a small chest, while Sarah, Daniel, and Rebecca were taken to the nursery. She was permitted to visit them only on Sunday afternoons, and the distance was agonizing. Sarah, now nearly 3 years old, didn't comprehend why Mama couldn't stay with them. She wailed every time Martha had to depart, clutching her skirts and pleading for her to stay. Daniel, 18 months old, would watch Martha leave with puzzled eyes, not old enough to grasp the situation, but old enough to feel deserted. And Rebecca, just 3 months old, was still nursing, which meant Martha had to express milk during the work week and carry it to the nursery, a painful and degrading process. Martha's work assignment was in the main residence, a world of elegance and decorum that seemed entirely detached from the harsh reality of the plantation outside. She was responsible for tidying the second-floor bedrooms, maintaining Jonathan Whitfield's private office, assisting with mail when he dictated letters, and serving at the table when he hosted visitors. Whitfield himself was a distant man who rarely spoke directly to his staff except to issue commands. He maintained a large household crew of 12 people who kept the house running with silent efficiency, and he demanded perfection. A speck of dust, a poorly creased napkin, or a letter with flawed penmanship could result in harsh discipline, though Whitfield himself rarely carried it out. Instead, he employed overseers who handled the physical punishment, maintaining the facade that he was above such crude actions. The labor was exhausting, but Martha found a certain solace in its consistency. The days followed rigid routines. The expectations were transparent. If she performed her tasks perfectly and remained invisible, she could exist in a kind of numb trance, her only focus being the survival required to reach Sunday when she could see her babies. But Cedar Hills had another presence that destroyed any hope of peace. Nathan Whitfield, Jonathan's son. Nathan was 21 years old, the only surviving child from Jonathan's marriage. He had been raised with every luxury wealth could provide, and had grown into a young man who believed the entire world existed to satisfy his whims. He had been kicked out of university in Virginia for gambling and intoxication. He had been sent home in shame, and his father had made him an assistant manager as a form of punishment and supposed character building. Nathan handled his role with the casual malice of someone who had never been refused and felt no sympathy for those beneath him. He drank heavily, gambled with the overseers and sons of neighboring planters, and viewed the enslaved workers as objects for his amusement or harm. He noticed Martha within days of her arrival. Martha was carrying fresh towels to the upstairs bedrooms when Nathan stepped out of his suite, clearly having just woken up despite it being mid-afternoon. He watched her work with blatant interest, making remarks about her looks that made her skin crawl. When she tried to move past him quickly, he blocked her way. "You're the new educated one, aren't you?" he said, his breath reeking of liquor despite the early hour. "Father says you can read and write. How does someone like you learn that?" Martha kept her gaze lowered. "Yes, sir. I was taught when I was small, sir." "Taught by who?" "Prove it. Read this." He snatched a book from a nearby stand and shoved it at her. Martha read the section he pointed out, her voice firm despite her racing pulse. Nathan laughed. "Well, I'll be damned. You actually can read, that's something. Father's got himself a clever one." He let her pass, but his eyes followed her as she moved away. The attention intensified quickly. Nathan started finding excuses to be wherever Martha was stationed. He would call her to his room to tidy up, even though it had already been serviced. He would command her to read to him from books or journals, sitting too close, touching her under the guise of pointing at the text. The other house staff warned Martha with their eyes and careful quiet. This was known territory. They had seen Nathan fixate on women before. They knew what happened when he decided he wanted something. Martha tried every tactic she knew to avoid him, working faster to finish before he showed up, staying in groups with other staff, trying to be so unremarkable he might forget her. Nothing worked. Nathan had decided he was interested, and in his world, his interest was the only thing that mattered. By spring 1844, the inevitable had occurred. Martha was pregnant for the fourth time. The exhaustion was crushing. 4 pregnancies in less than 4 years, 3 young children she could barely see, constant work demands, and now another child on the way. Martha felt herself fracturing in ways she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. She thought about running. The woods around Cedar Hills were thick, and she had heard hushed tales of people who had escaped and reached the north. But she had 3 children in the nursery. She couldn't take them with her. They were too small, would slow her down, and would make escape impossible, and she couldn't leave without them. The choice was impossible. So, she made no choice at all. She simply continued day after day, surviving. By late summer, Martha's condition was obvious. Jonathan Whitfield noticed when she was serving dinner one night and immediately called the head housekeeper to his study. Within a week, Jonathan had learned about Nathan's role. The confrontation was furious. Staff throughout the house heard the shouting, Jonathan's voice like thunder, Nathan's voice defensive and dismissive. The argument ended with Nathan being sent to manage a timber yard in northern Mississippi, effectively exiled from Cedar Hills. But this time, Jonathan Whitfield made a different choice regarding Martha. Rather than selling her at once, he kept her at the estate. Perhaps he felt that selling her would admit the problem publicly. Perhaps he calculated that she was valuable enough to retain despite the trouble. Or perhaps he simply hadn't yet identified the pattern that had followed Martha through 4 plantations. On November 7, 1844, Martha gave birth to her 4th child, a son. The birth was grueling. Martha hemorrhaged severely, losing enough blood that the midwife feared she wouldn't make it. The plantation physician was summoned, a rare cost for an enslaved woman's delivery, and managed to stop the bleeding. But Martha spent 2 weeks in the infirmary recovering. The birth record noted November 7, 1844, male infant born to Martha, household staff. Difficult delivery. Mother suffered significant blood loss, but survived with medical help. Child healthy. Weight approximately 6 lb, 8 Aussie. Father unknown. Medical costs $18, charged to the plantation medical account. Martha named her son Joshua, meaning God is salvation, though she felt further from salvation than ever. During Martha's recovery in the infirmary, Cedar Hills made a decision about her older children. Sarah, now 3.5 years old, was deemed old enough to start light chores. She was moved from the nursery to the main house where she would serve as a runner, carrying notes between buildings, bringing water to staff, and learning the basic tasks that would prepare her for domestic service. Martha learned about this when she finally left the infirmary and found Sarah working in the kitchen house, her small hands washing greens under the oversight of the head cook. Sarah's face brightened when she saw her mother, but she wasn't permitted to stop working. They could only trade glances, and Martha had to continue to her own post, her heart breaking. For the next 8 months, Martha lived in a kind of suspended state. She worked in the main house, saw Sarah occasionally during work hours, but couldn't speak to her beyond brief words, and visited Daniel and Rebecca in the nursery on Sundays, now with baby Joshua as well. Her body slowly mended from the difficult birth, though she remained weaker than before. The toll of 4 pregnancies and constant labor was adding up. She waited for the inevitable sale, expecting the trader to arrive any day. But months passed, and Jonathan Whitfield kept her at Cedar Hills. Martha began to cautiously hope that perhaps the pattern might be broken, that she might be allowed to stay in one place long enough to see her children grow. Then in August 1845, a trader named Sheffield arrived at Cedar Hills. Not Vernon Hughes, the original trader, but another man who worked similar routes. Jonathan Whitfield had decided that the complications now outweighed her value, and it was time to move on. The Cedar Hills Ledger recorded August 15, 1845, sale of Martha, age 24, with 4 children, ages 4 years, 3 months, 3 years, 2 months, 1 year, 9 months, and 9 months, sold to Sheffield Trading Company Mobile. Sale price $550. Reason: reduction of household staff, reassignment of assets. Proceeds applied to Estate Modernization Fund. Special notation: medical costs during recent pregnancy, 18, deducted from final asset valuation. The price continued to drop. Martha was now worth less than a third of her original purchase price, despite being only 24 years old and in the theoretical prime of her working years. Her children, rather than adding value, had become liabilities in the cold math of plantation economics. Martha was given 2 hours to get ready. She gathered her 4 children: Sarah, old enough to walk on her own; Daniel, needing to be carried half the time; Rebecca, toddling but still shaky; and Joshua, a 9-month-old infant. She wrapped Joshua against her chest in a sling, held Rebecca's hand, and urged Sarah to stay close while she tried to manage Daniel. The logistics of moving one woman with 4 small children were difficult. Sheffield provided a wagon with room for everyone, and Martha climbed in with her small, devastating cargo. 4 children born in violence, carried in suffering, and now being moved again because their very existence was proof of crimes that couldn't be named. As the wagon pulled away from Cedar Hills, Martha looked back at the estate that had been her home for 20 months. She saw the white-columned main house. She saw the nursery building where her children had lived apart from her. She saw the servants' quarters where she had slept in her tiny room alone while her children cried for her elsewhere on the land. 4 plantations, 4 pregnancies, 4 sales. And somehow, impossibly, Martha was still only 24 years old. One more plantation awaited her. The cycle was not finished, but Martha was. Sheffield's operation was based in Mobile, Alabama, a major port city that served as a hub for the domestic slave trade's western routes. Enslaved people were moved through Mobile to plantations throughout Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, feeding the endless demand for labor in the expanding cotton and sugar regions. Martha and her 4 children spent 3 weeks in Mobile, held in a warehouse facility near the docks. The building was packed with people awaiting sale, men bought for fieldwork, women for household service, children split from parents and sold for their future potential. The noise was constant, a mixture of crying, praying, and the harsh voices of the traders conducting business. Sheffield recognized that Martha's situation was commercially difficult. 4 young children made her hard to sell to most buyers. Her declining price history suggested she was problematic, but her literacy remained a selling point, and some buyers specifically wanted enslaved families that could be presented as humanely managed to counter growing criticism. Sheffield found his buyer in Louisiana, Henry Delacroix, a Creole planter whose family had owned Magnolia Grove for 3 generations. Delacroix was looking for an educated servant to assist with plantation mail and household management, and he was wealthy enough to absorb the cost of supporting 4 young children until they reached working age. The sale was negotiated through letters, with Sheffield painting Martha as a valuable investment despite her family encumbrances. Delacroix agreed to the purchase, and in late September 1845, Martha and her children were moved westward into Louisiana. The journey covered more than 200 miles through the coastal lands, a landscape unlike anything Martha had ever seen. The land was flat and wet, cut through with bayous and swamps, thick with Spanish moss hanging from live oaks. The air smelled of mud and decay and the specific sweetness of sugar cane. Magnolia Grove sat in Louisiana's sugar country, where the agricultural cycle was different and more dangerous than cotton. Sugar farming demanded precise timing, planting in the spring, cultivation through summer, and then the brutal harvest season from October through December, when the entire plantation worked 20-hour days to cut cane and process it before frost could ruin the crop. The grinding season was called the killing time because of the accidents in the mills, the exhaustion-related deaths, and the brutal pace that pushed workers past human limits. The Magnolia Grove records show September 28, 1845, purchase of one female Martha, age 24 with 4 children, ages 4 years, 5 months, 3 years, 4 months, 1 year, 11 months, and 10 months. Former owner, Sheffield Trading via Cedar Hills Plantation, Alabama. Purchase price, $500. Skills, literacy, correspondence, household management. Assignment, main house, personal attendant to owner. Children to be housed with mother in separate cabin. Special notation, family unit purchase. Premium paid for documented literacy skills. Henri Delacroix was 58 years old, a sophisticated man who had been educated in France and maintained ties to New Orleans Creole society. He was a widower who had never remarried after his wife's death 15 years earlier. His 3 daughters were all married and living in New Orleans, leaving him alone at Magnolia Grove with a household staff of 12 and the 200 field workers who kept his sugar operation running. Unlike the other plantations, Delacroix assigned Martha a small cabin near the main house where she could live with all 4 of her children. It was the first time since Cedar Hills that Martha had been allowed to keep her children with her, and the relief was overwhelming. Sarah, now 4.5, could finally sleep near her mother. Daniel, 3.5, and Rebecca, 2, could play nearby while Martha worked, and Joshua, 10 months old, could nurse whenever needed. The cabin was small, perhaps 10 ft by 12 ft, but it was theirs, and after the separations of Cedar Hills, Martha felt a cautious gratitude that she immediately distrusted. Experience had taught her that anything given could be snatched away. Her work assignment was as Delacroix's personal attendant, serving his meals, maintaining his private chambers, managing his mail, and organizing his study. Delacroix was a demanding employer, but not a violent one. He had exacting standards, but he didn't rage or strike his servants for minor failures. Instead, he used a system of small privileges and withdrawals. He was fascinated by Martha's literacy. He would have her read to him while he ate breakfast, passages from French novels or New Orleans newspapers. He would dictate letters while she wrote them in her careful script. "You have an unusual mind," he said once, watching her write. "It's a waste, really. In different circumstances, you might have been educated, accomplished, but circumstances are what they are." Martha said nothing. The man who owned her body was musing about how in some other world she might have been treated as human. The relationship Delacroix developed with Martha was different from what she had experienced elsewhere. He didn't use crude violence. Instead, he created a framework of implied consent that was just as coercive. He offered small gifts, extra rations for her children, a better blanket, fabric for new clothes. He positioned these as evidence of his benevolence. The unspoken understanding was clear. Accept his attention, and life will be easier. Resist, and the children will be sent to the quarters. By early 1846, Martha was pregnant for the 5th time. This pregnancy felt different psychologically. Martha recognized with perfect clarity that she was trapped. 5 plantations, 5 pregnancies, 5 men who had taken what they wanted. She thought about the river near Magnolia Grove, about walking into it with stones in her pockets. But then she would look at Sarah, now 5 and frighteningly intelligent, who had learned to read basic words by watching Martha. She would look at Daniel, Rebecca, and Joshua, and she would decide to survive one more day. Because if she was gone, who would protect them? So Martha survived, and the pregnancy continued. In September 1846, she gave birth to her 5th child, a daughter. The Magnolia Grove record noted September 3, 1846, female infant born to Martha, personal attendant, healthy delivery, child weight approximately 7 lb. Mother recovered well. Father unknown, special notation. Mother granted 2 weeks recovery period per H. Delacroix's instruction. Martha named this daughter Grace. And then something unexpected happened. Delacroix didn't sell her. Weeks passed, then months. Martha waited for the trader to arrive, for the familiar pattern to unfold. But it didn't happen. For the first time, Martha remained at a plantation after giving birth. Through the rest of 1846, 1847, and 1848, she worked and cared for her children. Sarah turned 7. Old enough to be put to work as a house servant. Daniel, 6, was assigned to carry water. Rebecca, 5, was learning to sew. Martha began to dare to hope, not for freedom, but simply for this to continue. Then, on October 14, 1848, Henry Delacroix died suddenly. He was found in his study, having suffered a massive heart condition. He had no heirs who wanted the plantation, so the entire estate was put up for auction. The auction was held on December 12, 1848. Martha and her 5 children were sold as a family unit to a cotton broker from Mississippi for $475. The document recorded Lot 47, one female Martha, age 28 with 5 children. Sale price $475 to William Foster, Jackson, Mississippi. Special notation, family unit price reflects significant dependent burden. $475. That was what Martha and her 5 children were worth after 8 years and 5 pregnancies. Less than $800 total. As the wagon pulled away from Magnolia Grove on December 15, 1848, Martha looked back one final time. She was 28 years old. She had given birth to 5 children on 5 different plantations across 4 states. She had survived, but the ledger only cared about the price. The story of Martha is a haunting testament to how history can be written in the margins of ledgers and the silence of courthouse basements. For 160 years, she was just a series of declining numbers, a line item in a ledger of human suffering. But through the work of historians, those numbers have been transformed back into a narrative of incredible resilience. The legacy of the ledger, Martha's journey across 5 plantations and 4 states, illustrates a truth often left out of history books, that the domestic slave trade wasn't just about labor, but about the systematic erasure of human dignity to protect the reputations of the powerful. While the men who abused her were exiled or reassigned, Martha and her children bore the true cost in blood and separation. Her devaluation from $800 to $275 was the world's way of trying to break her. Yet, the fact that she taught her daughter Sarah to read in secret and that she fought to keep her family together for as long as the law allowed, proves that her value was never something that could be captured in dollars and cents. Honoring the invisible. Today, Martha's records are preserved in climate-controlled archives, but her spirit exists in the millions of untold stories that were never written down. We study her life not just to mourn what was lost, but to recognize the patterns of the past so they are never repeated. Martha was 19 when her documented journey began. She was 32 when she vanished into the Texas wilderness. 13 years of systematic violence could not destroy her humanity, and 160 years of silence could not keep her story from the light. If Martha's journey through the hidden machinery of the past moved you, please help us keep these voices alive. Sharing these stories is the only way to ensure that the invisibles of history are finally seen. For more deep dives into the patterns of the past and the stories that the archives tried to hide, subscribe to Strange History.